one kicking the things out of orbit.
Oh my gosh!
One of the greatest fighters.
John Jones beat every champion pretty much never lived.
If Khabib gets his hands on McGregor, it's going to be that night.
Let's get into it. And we are back, and better than ever, with another great episode of This Week in MMA. As always, one half of your hosting duo, Craig Allen. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at CraigAllenFNP. And with me, to my left, your right, we have, as always, one half the hosting duo, Matt Allen. You can find him on the respective socials at MattAllenFNP. And Matt, there's a lot of people out there that are probably finding This Week in MMA for the first time, and you're wondering, hey, who are these long vampire-looking guys? Well, let me tell you what. We love to talk about MMA. We've been doing Fight Night picks for just over 3 years. We just celebrated the channel's anniversary just this month in the last couple of weeks, so it's really exciting stuff for us. But we are back in and entering the ring of the professional boxing YouTube star crossover, and I'm really looking forward to talking about it in This Week in MMA because, of course, one half of your Triller main event being Funky Ben Askren, a fighter that a lot of fight fans knew before he came to the UFC, had tons of success with Bellator and won championship, but boy did he make an impact for better or for worse when he was with the UFC.
If you could have told me what Ben Askren's career trajectory was when he had first left Bellator, I never would have believed you. If you had said, oh yeah, he's going to go fight in one championship, become their champion, take about a year and a half off, have the weirdest UFC run of all time, oh and by the way, to top it all off, he's going to box a YouTube personality, I'd say, hey, that's ridiculous. But no, this is the world that we're living in. And to top it all off, we don't just have boxing this weekend, a really fun Bellator card too.
Big time Bellator card, big time UFC card this weekend as well. If you missed out on any of that stuff, you can find all the content here, Fight Night Picks, as well as FightNightPicks.com. But Matt, we're talking about it. I mean, I threw it out there in the YouTube community tab, the fact that we caught a lot of flack when we talked about Mike Tyson, Roy Jones Jr. There were some MMA fighters on there. Rashad Coulter was originally supposed to fight Hasim Rahman Jr. That one fell out. But listen, 812 votes so far in the community tab. 73% say give us the Askren versus Paul content. And 27% say stay in your lane. Matt, we're breaking out of our lane. We're going to be talking about that. We've got a big time show planned for you. So Matt, let's throw it on over to my favorite segment of the show. This one's called the Twitter Purge.
It's time for the Twitter Purge.
And when we're talking about the Twitter Purge, we're going to bring up three of the bigger stories right now going on inside of the world of MMA. And the biggest story, Matt, I mean, Conor McGregor, Dustin Poirier 3, it seems like it was official, and then it wasn't, and now it is all of a sudden. And listen, there were 2 or 3 days of fighting between these two-star athletes over on Twitter, all for it to kind of break loose, and all of a sudden, Brett Okamoto, the guys at ESPN, have the news that the fight will take place this summer. Matt, to me, it's less of a surprise, but the events that unfolded before the news broke really seemed to muddy the waters.
The Twitter beef really made no sense to me, if I'm being completely honest, because this is one of the few fights that kind of can promote itself. Conor beat Dustin once. Dustin beat Conor once. They both won by knockout. Well, why not have a third fight? That's the easy tiebreaker. And then there was the whole, did Conor not donate the money? I doubt Dustin Poirier would lie about that.
And but then he backed off it.
Then he backed off, said it wasn't, my place to say it all in the media. Conor couldn't have responded to all this in a worse way, though, when he was saying, like, oh, it was a debt, it was not a donation. Like, it was just really weird from both guys. But I've been watching The Last Dance lately, and the thing about The Last Dance is that when Michael Jordan talks about how much he wants to win, he doesn't care about, like, oh, do my Twitter followers think I want to win? Like, that's all he cared about was winning. If they ever do make a Last Dance style documentary about Conor McGregor one day, I really doubt his motives behind him wanting to be champion are going to be the same as a Michael Jordan per se, because just the whole way McGregor had handled it, like, hey, I know you beat me, but, like, we're not going to fight now, even though I'm the one who asked us to have a third fight. It was just a really, really odd situation. I am happy that they are finally fighting. I think this will be a really interesting fight. I know a lot of people are upset that neither one of these halves are going to be in that Charles Oliveira, Michael Chandler fight for the title, but here's the thing. The UFC with some fighters can do these money fights. And I do think Poirier, McGregor, of course, Masvidal, Diaz, those are all those kind of money fight kind of fighters. And if they do want to have one-offs, and if they choose that, okay, I would rather go for the opponent that can bring me the most money and not go for the title, if that's what the fighter chooses, you kind of have to agree with them on it. I mean, I'd probably do the same thing if I was in their position.
Yeah, I mean, listen, we've had money fights in the past, and you never fault the fighter for taking it. You had Kamaru Usman, Jorge Masvidal. That drew a lot of eyeballs. But with a fight like this, it's just odd with all the circumstances, but also they just fought. They just fought back in January, and it was one of those ones where it wasn't even close. Like, there was a chance, obviously, McGregor could get the finish, but It wasn't even close when they stepped into the cage. Where do you think McGregor's going to go from January to this summer? I don't see a big progression in his skills. Did he blame his coaching? Did he blame the fact that he only trained boxing, but he didn't really factor in the kicks? I mean, the guy had years to train for this fight just to come up with more and more excuses and to call his opponent an inbred hillbilly and then a brain-dead hillbilly. It's just not great sportsmanship, and it's one of those ones where, listen, Conor's going to be Conor, and we're all along for the ride, so we'll see what happens, but really interested to see how this one plays out going on this summer. All right, Matt, and our next bit of news, everybody that's tuned into This Week in MMA, we know you're big Bellator fans out there, and you want to hear more from the boys talking about Bellator, Matt. Two of our favorite guys to watch, and these guys are so exciting. We have Douglas Lima, the perennial welterweight champ, and when he loses it, he usually finds a quick path back to the title. He will be defending his belt against Yaroslav Amosov coming up shortly. That one's June 11th. What a fight we have here. And if you look at those Bellator rankings, a lot of fighters vying for that opportunity. Jason Jackson had a really big win a few weeks ago against Naaman Gracie. Maybe he threw his hat in the ring. But I think this is the deserving candidate in Yaroslav Amosov, a guy that, listen, fight fans still might not know him. He's 25-0. And you look at the guys that he's beat since he's come over to Bellator from Tech Crep. If you've ever heard of Tech Crep, you're either great or you're not so great, but you look at the names. Gerald Harris, UFC vet. Eric Silva, UFC vet. David Rickles, longtime Bellator vet. Ed Ruth, I mean, one of the best wrestlers to make the transition to MMA we've ever seen. And then he beat Mark Lemminger handily, and in his last time out, a split decision win over Logan Storley, another very, very credentialed wrestler. It's awesome to see American top teams Yaroslav Amosov on such a rise, taking on American top team Atlanta's Douglas Lima. Guy, again, I can't stress this enough. When he loses the title or is away from the title for 3 seconds, it's boom, when can we book this guy for another title shot? He's one of the best welterweights in the world, not just outside of the UFC, just in the world, period. I love this fight. What are you thinking?
I agree with you, and I really like what you had said, too, about him being one of the best welterweights in the world, because Douglas Lima, whenever we get those questions of, oh, who's the guy outside the UFC that you could really see make a name for themselves inside the UFC, Douglas Lima, more often than not, is one of the first guys who comes to mind. And the really fun thing about this matchup, too, do you know Yaroslav Amosov fights a lot like? Kind of like Colby Covington, kind of like Kamaru Usman. Yes, he might not be as well-rounded as those guys.
Not quite there.
Not quite there, but he will offer the wrestling component that both those guys can add. So if you are somebody who would like to see Douglas Lima eventually, maybe sometime in the near future, fight a guy like Usman, fight a guy like Covington, stylistically, this might be a bit of a precursor to that, and I'm extremely excited for this fight. There's so many good fighters in Bellator's welterweight division that really any title shot that you can have with Douglas Lima, Jason Jackson's out there, the Neiman Gracie's if he can make his way back up to the title, just so many great fighters out there for Bellator. I really do feel like this is kind of their marquee division right now.
Big fight for Lima, especially coming off that middleweight title loss in a weird fight against Gegard Mousasi where he had a little bit of success. He had a lot of success with the leg kicks. It'll be interesting to see how he can make out against the undefeated Ukrainian fighter, Yaroslav Amosov. And Matt, our last bit of news, and this is a really interesting one, and it might have flown under the radar. Rafael Fiziev kind of out of action, out of commission, so to speak, with COVID. But the bit of news that you may have also missed is the fact that, and these are just rumors, they've just been thrown out there on Twitter, but it's looking more and more like Rafael Fiziev is going to be taking on Kevin Lee this summer in July. That's a low-key banger in a loaded lightweight division. That's
a matchup anyone can get excited for, and that fight really is the definition of a clash of styles. Fiziev, one of the best pure strikers in the lightweight division. I don't feel like that is a far stretch to say. I understand he might not have been able to prove his striking acumen in the UFC like some other guys have, but if you watch this man strike, it is an absolute pleasure. And for Kevin Lee, the wrestling, and then in his last fight against Gregor Gillespie, he can kick a little bit now too. Now, of course, the big storyline going into that fight will, of course, be the double ACL surgeries of Kevin Lee.
Well, now that was his last win. See, then he went out there and took on Charles Oliveira, and it was, as Michael Chiavello would say, good night, Irene, and we haven't seen him since.
Which, it really is unfortunate, because Kevin Lee is a guy who a lot of people think, like, hey, if Kevin Lee can really get it together, he can fight for the title one day. Kevin Lee, future champ. Like, he's a guy who, if he could only just put it all together, he has that kind of a ceiling. And now with this extended layoff due to his injury, I'm kind of curious what version of Kevin Lee we're going to get, because I know I'm the person who likes to say, hey, ACLs, Probably not a great sign. But some guys, if they do take a big layoff, you can get better. You can improve your skills with that layoff. So for Kevin Lee, I really think it matters how he applied himself during this layoff. Let's say he did the GSP where, yeah, you might not be fighting, but you're constantly in the gym. You're always trying to get better. Then we might really see that Kevin Lee 2.0 in this fight. And here's just another thing that this is really nice if you are an unranked fighter in the lightweight division. Most of the time on Twitter, if you don't have a ranking next to your name, you have to call out everybody in the rankings to get a fight. Because everyone in the rankings, well, they just want to fight each other. No one wants to get dropped out. So for Fiziev, when I first read the tweet that, hey, I couldn't accept the fight against the top 15 guy, I was really disappointed. I was like, oh no, they're going to have to make him fight 2, maybe 3 more fights, and then he'll get that big name opportunity. It is just really nice that they are getting him back in there with a top guy at 155.
And with Fiziev, I mean, the striking coach at Tiger Muay Thai. With Kevin Lee, perennial wrestler. But you're right. I mean, as his career's progressed, his striking's got a little bit better. And sometimes he gets dominated in certain wrestling positions. And sometimes the grappling gets the better of him. And it seems like his mind works quicker than his body can. Sometimes. So hopefully, you never know. With the big headpiece, he can really work things together. Will it be with Dewey Cooper? Will it be with TriStar? We'll see what happens. But sometimes, apparently, Dewey Cooper can breed champs. And for Firas Zahabi, well, we haven't seen a title in that gym in a while, so we'll see what happens. But I love the booking, so it seems, so the rumors might say, but it seems like a really interesting one moving forward.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a lot of breaking news out there, as always, so make sure you're tuning in with Fight Night Picks, because we also have early stoppage that tapes tonight between myself and John Franklin. It'll come out in the next couple of days. But there's big news always breaking, so you want to keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, as we always say. Now, Matt, we've had a lot of great fighter interviews here on the channel, and there's some big ones coming out shortly. Kai Kamaka III is one that we have banked. We just released one with Rude Boy Randy Brown. And I want to say, and I will say, we have a big-time champion, double champion, that has an interview set to come out here in the following days. So you're going to want to keep it locked in. That one is insane. But with Randy Brown, he's a guy that's coming back off of an insane fight where he wasn't able to get the win over Vicente Luque. He's been out for a little bit. He was originally supposed to be taking on Alex Oliveira just a short time ago. That fight's been rebooked for UFC 261. And I really want to throw it over to Randy, because this is a guy that has really, really good insight on the game. So let's throw it over to friend of the show, now member of the show, JHK, and Rude Boy himself, Randy Brown.
Definitely. Now, coming off a loss or coming off a win, is anything different? Take us inside the mental preparations leading up to this fight.
My mentality remains the same, man. I'm one who's always looking to move forward. I'm always looking to grow. I'm never the same guy, and that's fact. That's proven in every one of my bouts. I'm constantly getting better. I'm always looking for improvement. And the mental side of it for me it's the same. Just constant growth, keep moving forward, and take everything for what it is. You know what I mean? Take everything for what it is and just build off of it. No excuses. Just getting right to it, man. Getting right to it. Trying to get this money. You know what I mean? Trying to feed my family and crush these goals. That's all.
That's facts, because I think I've been interviewing you. I think this is like my 5th or 6th interview with you, and that's a while, man. That's some years right there, going back. And yeah,
we go back, bro.
Yeah, we do go back, and I see the development, man, and I love it. I love to see and talk to fighters and just their mannerisms change, over time, and they mature. That's the main thing. And if I don't see the maturity, it's just like, oh man, something is not right.
Well, I'll tell you what. Here, there's a lot of maturity. There's a lot of growth every day. I'm a student of the game. I'm very tedious when it comes to, my progression and just everything that I go through. Every experience that I've gone through within the octagon, it makes me who I am today. It's making me a better fighter. Like we spoke on my last fight, obviously didn't go the way I wanted it to go. And I have my feelings on that, you know what I mean? And I still stand by those feelings. So now I went back and I corrected those things and I made sure that doesn't happen again, right? So it's just about accountability and don't look over things, you know what I mean? Don't just let things go by. You got to really, stop yourself, see what it is, take it for what it is, and take it head on and fix it. Yeah, pretty much it.
And Matt, really glad to hear from Randy Brown, a guy that you always have to keep your radar on at 170 pounds, because you never know, he could go on a sneaky little run. One of the taller, longer guys at 70, and if he really employs his leg kicks with his wrestling that we know that he has and a boxing background, what an interesting guy. I love that fight coming up against Oliveira. And to listen to Randy speak throughout the entire interview about the mentality of coming back off a loss, not really thinking on it or really letting it bother you and just getting back to the grind. Awesome stuff to hear. And like I said, love that fight.
Yeah, we've heard about that a lot from fighters recently. You have guys like Francis Ngannou saying that once they really were able to kind of unlock that part of their game on the mental side of things, they were really able to, show off a new side of their skill set. Anthony Pettis, before his fight against Alex Morono, like, those are the things that you really like to hear fighters talk about, because it always shows that, yeah, they care about the X's and O's inside the cage, but they're also at the presence of mind to think about, okay, if I'm in the best spot in my life, then I can really compete at the highest level. So really great stuff from Randy Brown there.
Awesome stuff. Make sure you check out the interview with Randy Brown as well as the other interviews on the channel from JHK, with some really big ones dropping shortly. And Matt, this is the part of the show that we tease from the open. Listen, 73% of the fans out there, they're going to watch it and they're not going to tear us to shreds. They said that they want the Askren versus Paul content. You're going to get the Fight Night Picks prediction on that fight. That's coming up this Saturday. But we also have a really big Bellator card. Bellator 257, one whole side of the bracket. You've got, Yoel Romero, Rumble Johnson. You've got Ryan Bader, who just won his fight. But if we go top and then bottom, we have two big fights. Dovletdzhan Yagshimuradov is taking one really tough out in the man formerly known as Beast in 25-8, Corey Anderson. And we also have a great rematch for the title, Vadim Nemkov taking on Mr. Wonderful, Phil Davis, not Kevin O'Leary. So you're going to want to keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt. I cannot wait to talk about celebrity boxing once more. As we always say with Fight Night Picks, let's get into it. If you used to be an MMA fan and you casually watch Bellator and Spike TV and you check out the occasional one championship card on YouTube, you might recognize the fighter to my right. We have Funky Ben Askren, and this guy was a champion of champions. He would ride him, cowboy, in the cage and beat every single opponent known to man. Until he went over to the UFC and he went 1-2 overall. I mean, listen, the guy didn't have the greatest run over there, and it was just a league of killers. Robbie Lawler, former champ, Jorge Masvidal, BMF champ, Damian Maia, uncrowned champ, and it just didn't work out for him there. I mean, listen, he was a victim of the quickest knockout of all time in the cage, but he has really tried to reinvent himself, and all of a sudden slots into a big-time boxing match against the problem child, YouTube's own Jake Paul, a guy who's 2-0 so far in his young boxing career, and he has a huge advantage in one key area, and it is the age category. Much younger than Ben Askren coming into this fight. He also hasn't had either of his hips replaced, and for Ben Askren, hip replacement back in September. I will cover that in a bit, but Matt, we talked about Jake Paul the last time out. He was supposed to be taking on Nate Robinson, and he did. And oh boy, did one of my childhood idols get KTFO.
Yeah, that was a really bad performance by Nate Robinson in that fight. But here's the thing. I went back and watched the Nate Robinson fight, hoping I would see something in that fight that I could somehow compare to Ben Askren. But this is my problem. I can't give you the best detail as to what Jake Paul's boxing is at, just because look at what he did against Nate Robinson. Nate Robinson, as a boxer, he wasn't really in that fight. And the weird thing for Robinson was, yes, in the pre-fight, he was hitting the gloves and all that stuff, but once he was really in the cage, let's be honest, Nate Robinson jumped a lot, and he just kind of, I don't even really want to use the term blitz, because then I think about it like a Wonder Boy Thompson who does it effectively, but in effect, that's really what Nate Robinson was doing. And yes, I understand he was the much smaller guy in that matchup, and I know Ben Askren and Jake Paul physically will match up a little bit more similar that way, but I do think that Jake Paul's boxing, there's just such a big question mark next to it. I do know he has 2 professional fights, but I feel like I have a much better say on other guys who have 2 professional fights, just because the level of competition that Jake Paul's fought, it's just been so... I just don't really know what to make of it.
So if you look at his first fight, he took on Anisan Gibb, fellow YouTuber. And Matt, we did a whole preview of that fight as well. It's kind of crazy. We're 3 fights into Jake Paul's career. We've already done 2 breakdowns, so fuck it. Let's get into the third one. But if we focus on that first fight, it was the same thing. I mean, Anisan Gibb had trained with good boxing trainers over in England. But when he was in there, he was wonky. He was keeping his hands way out. He was nowhere near the level of technical boxer Jake Paul was. And when I say technical boxer, this is a guy with 2 pro fights. Now, he has dedicated himself to it. But when I talk boxing technique, and I talk MMA technique, as Corey Anderson would say, there's levels to this. There's big levels. I will tell you from Jake Paul, you do see some of the things that you like to see. You do see some fundamentals in there. And listen, I went through the quotables for this one. There was an article out there from Boxing Scene, notable publication, and they were talking to BJ Flores, who is Jake Paul's trainer. Listen, this guy went 34-4-1. He had a big loss to Tony Bellew. Sometimes that's going to happen.
Pretty good
Former champion, 21 knockouts in his career. So BJ Flores, a good guy to have in your corner. And if you look at Jake Paul too, I mean, he had the cannon Shannon Briggs in his corner before.
Champ is here!
But Matt, the Jadakiss references aside, BJ Flores went with this one. Jake has been sparring and training with top professionals for over 18 months now. Matt, if I had a little bit of money and I could take a pro fight, I could end up at American Top Team, or I could end up at one of the mega gyms that's not invite only. I wouldn't end up at a Ruka Sport, but I could go to a major gym and train with other professionals. That means nothing.
Yeah,
that means nothing.
Exactly. I could play one-on-one with LeBron James. He's so much better than me. I'm not learning anything because of that experience. And that's the thing about Jake Paul. I'm going to reference some of our MMA videos here, so just hear me out. I like to reference how every now and then in an MMA fighter, in an up-and-coming MMA fighter's career, they get to different fights, and it's kind of like a skill check for them, where they finally fight that wrestler, or they fight that guy who has great leg kicks. Just, they always have to fight those different fighters, and they have to get over that hump. Jake Paul has never faced the professional fighter's hump. Now, I understand that's a very big hump for a guy who has had 2 pro fights, but just hear me out. Jake Paul, and at least what everyone says about fighting, I shouldn't even say Jake Paul, but everyone says about fighting, no one's afraid of getting knocked out. What people are afraid of is being exhausted and not being able to defend themselves. Jake Paul's never been in that situation, and I'm sure his coaches are going to say, well, yes, he has been in that situation, but this is my problem. Jake Paul's been the most famous person in every room he's been in since a very young age, and the issue with that is that if you're Jake Paul walking into a boxing gym, yes, the people in there are primary boxers, but they're not going to go as hard as they possibly can on you because, well, you're Jake Paul, and they don't gain anything by knocking you out in the gym. If they hurt you in the gym, well, there's no cameras in most gyms, so he can make up whatever story he wants to. And since his platform's bigger, well, people are going to believe his side of whatever story it is. I think Ben Askren, all his game plan is in this fight is to make Jake Paul as tired as he can. And I know how Jake Paul came out and said, oh no, well, there's clauses in the contract that say if Ben Askren uses any MMA techniques, he will have to forfeit all of his purse. But this is my point. There is wrestling in boxing to a certain degree. It's not the full-blown wrestling Ben Askren's used to at the Olympic level, but there is some clinch work. There is some body-on-body contact. And in my mind, Ben Askren's going to make this fight terribly boring for about 3 rounds. 3 out of the 8 rounds. All he has to do is make Jake Paul work. Get as much lactic acid in those arms as he possibly can. Because Jake Paul has never had to go into a fight where he's genuinely concerned for his well-being, where he is exhausted. Ben Askren fought Douglas Lima in a locked cage. He fought him for 25 minutes. He knows what that fear and that exhaustion is of fighting at the highest level known to man, and that's just something Jake Paul hasn't had to really face yet. So I'm not saying Jake Paul can't be that guy in the future. I just haven't seen him prove to me that he is that guy yet, and that's why for me it is hard to pick Jake Paul, but I'm really curious to get your thoughts on this.
The weird thing is the level of competition, because for Ben Askren, again, it's totally different. You can talk about Koreshkov, you can talk about Lima, you can say, well, that was early on in their careers, and you're right, you are right. And Ben Askren at one point, one of the best welterweights in the world, and when he was in the UFC, Robbie Lawler, fluke win or not, he was still fighting very, very good fighters. Now, if you focus on their last attempt at combat sports, for Jake Paul, a knockout that broke the internet. That was probably almost as impressive as Mike Tyson, Roy Jones Jr. Like, that really made big-time headlines, and we wouldn't get a headliner with Jake Paul the next time out if it wasn't so impressive. But for Jake Paul, huge knockout over a name that a lot of people recognize. For Ben Askren, he looked awful. He fought Damian Maia on an early card on a Saturday in Singapore, and he did not look good in that fight. But here's the thing. Damian Maia is one of the best grapplers on the face of this planet, especially in MMA, and this fight's a boxing fight. So, if you look at it for Ben Askren, D1 All-American, Olympian, and then you focus in on his boxing, well, he trains at Rufus Sport with Duke Rufus. We have some good strikers out of Rufus Sport. We've seen the Pettis brothers. We have Gerald Meerschaert fighting this weekend. Not a good striker. Paul Felder is a good striker. There's quite a few good strikers there. In MMA,
Tyron Woodley can back up and throw right hands.
Tyron Woodley when he was fighting Josh Koscheck 8 years ago. And then we look at this. He spent a little bit of time training with Freddie Roach. Now, whether that was for the Instagrams or not, who knows? But Freddie definitely in his corner as far as publicity is concerned. But we've seen from Ben Askren the combinations. We've seen him doing the pad work. The footwork looks pretty good. He did get that hip cleaned up, and that could be a concern for sure. So I wrote it down. He had a Birmingham hip, they call it. They clean it up, they grind it off, and boom. Next day, he said he felt pain-free, but he hasn't felt pain since September. And this is a guy that forever, up, down, up, down, up, down. Matt, Our grandfather had multiple hip
He did,
replacements.
and he wasn't fighting Jake Paul the next day.
And he wasn't fighting Jake Paul the next day. But every time he got one, he did feel better.
He did.
A lot of hip replacements. But we focus on a fight like this for Jake Paul. Again, great to see the BJ Flores connection. Not great to hear the CTE stuff. You can't promote a fight with that.
Exactly, and that's where I just don't really understand what he was doing in that, and I do really want to get your opinion. If you're trying to sell a fight, I understand Jake Paul.
That's how you get a license pulled.
Exactly. For Jake Paul, like, I get it. You want people to think that this is what you do now. Like, when they associate Jake Paul, they don't want to think Jake Paul the YouTuber. He wants people to think Jake Paul the boxer. But my problem is, you don't sell fights by trying to tell people you already have brain damage 2 fights into your career. Because that's either going to suggest that, A, you don't have a chin whatsoever, and you must have been out on your feet in that Nate Robinson fight, and you just had a really good poker face, or you have the worst training regimen known to man of any combat sports athlete ever. And that's just really weird, because for me, that doesn't promote the fight. I feel terrible if someone says that. Like, remember, and this is taking it to a much more serious degree, of course. Remember that Spencer Fisher article that came out not that long ago?
Yeah.
And him actually speaking about, like, no, I had crazy fights in my life, and now I have consequences because of it. The fact that Jake Paul's kind of, I don't want to say making a mockery of that, but using that as a way to promote his fight, it's just distasteful for me.
I don't like it for sure. And I mean, and when we're talking about the odds on this fight, I mean, Jake Paul minus 180 favorite, Ben Askren at a plus 150. Listen, I don't know anything about the world of semi-professional yet professional YouTube versus MMA star boxing, so I'm not, condoning going with this one.
But we've broken down all 3 of his fights. Are we experts in the field
Yikes,
now?
I would not say so. But Ben Askren, listen, as an underdog, I have to go with the guy that has a lot more combat sports experience in this. I mean, I do. Listen, could Jake Paul go in there and knock him out like Jorge Masvidal did? Sure he could. It's a fight. But I do see Askren playing the long game, wearing him out. You look at the first 2 fights in his career, they were both 6-rounders for Jake Paul. This one being an 8-round fight. I'm totally fine with Ben Askren's cardio going into this one. I'm going with the MMA guy that's been doing combat sports for a very long time over a guy who's been training hard for 18 months.
So I'm going to quote Chael Sonnen. Chael Sonnen said that GSP was the first person ever who weaponized their pace. And I'm going to use that term to describe what Ben Askren has to do for his game plan. Weaponize your pace, because again, Jake Paul's been tired in his life. I'm sure he's run a race, and at the end of it, he was tired. But Ben Askren knows what it's like to not only be tired, but to be completely exhausted and still have to defend yourself against a highly, highly skilled fighter in the cage. That's an experience that you don't get until you have experienced it. Like, I don't know you have that until you do have that. So for Jake Paul, maybe one day he does have one of those fights where he gets dropped like Ryan Garcia, gets up and finishes the fight, and it proves to me, wow, Jake Paul really has what it takes. But I don't think that's going to be the case against Ben Askren.
Both of us going somewhat maybe reluctantly with Ben Askren. We'll see what happens. But yeah, this one out of our wheelhouse. You let us know down in the comments below who you're going to go with between the man himself, the problem child. Is he the problem man now? Jake Paul and funky Ben Askren. Matt, big time week. We've got Bellator 257, so stick around for those videos. We also have UFC Fight Night, Whitaker versus Gastelum. And if you like the video, as always, toss us a like, toss us a sub, and as we always say with Fight Night picks, let's get into it. Really looking forward to our co-main event, this week's Bellator 257 card. As always, one half of your hosting duo, Craig Allen. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Craig Allen FNP. To my right, your left, vice versa, Matt Allen. You can find him on the respective socials at Matt Allen FNP. And Matt, in our co-main event on one side of the bracket, the winner of this fight will be taking on Darth Vader. We have Beastin 25-8/overtime, Corey Anderson, taking on the Bellator newcomer, Dovletdzhan Yagshimuradov. Matt, straight up love the fight. As soon as I saw the weird silhouette on the Bellator website just last year that Yagshimuradov would end up in Bellator, my mind was blown. This is the former ACA champ, and if you've ever paid attention to the organization, they have some very, very good light heavyweight fighters. We've seen great prospects coming from Russia, including one of the fighters that Yagshimuradov had fought in the past, Magomed Ankalaev, but there are very quality names on his record, and there's lots of great wins against those quality opponents for Dovletdzhan.
I mean, yeah, look at Joaquim Christensen, exactly. He was coming off a knockout. Now, yes, he did get knocked out in under a minute by Dominic Reyes, but that's going can happen. Dominic Reyes is really good. And then he loses to Dovletdzhan. This is a really interesting fight because for Corey Anderson, I don't want to say they gave him kind of an underhand toss in his Bellator debut, but there's not a lot of gimme fights until...
An aging middleweight kickboxer.
Exactly. And the fact, like, you could just tell when Melvin Manhoef walked out to the cage, you're like, well, obviously that man doesn't belong in 205 pounds. And just the whole fight, it went exactly how you would expect it. Melvin Manhoef still has oddly fast hands for the size and age of him, but he would flurry, and the Corey Anderson gonna take you down, rinse and repeat. And that's what makes this fight really, really fun, because for Yagshimuradov, he can have some of those flurries like Melvin Manhoef, and his hand speed is one of the things that I really picked up on. Is he has far better hand speed than Corey Anderson. I would even say he has better power than Corey Anderson. Now, yes, Corey Anderson not really known as a striker, but we all know what Anderson's going to do in this fight. He's going to try to get the fight to the mat. So for Yagshimuradov, it's going to be really interesting. One of the things I picked up on was naturally he does carry his hands very low, and a lot of the time, especially against top tier competition, I would say, well, that's a terrible idea. But against Corey Anderson, that might actually be your best path to victory. And it reminds me of when Jared Gooden had fought Nurmagomedov. And Gooden the whole time, yes, he was the superior striker. He just kept his hands down the whole time because he had such disdain for the striker Nurmagomedov. Turns out he could strike pretty well. But going into this fight, that's the best way to defend a takedown. If your hands are naturally low and you're not fighting the most dangerous striker in the world, just your hands being low are going to help you with your reaction time, with your footwork, and with some of that forward pressure that Corey Anderson's going to bring to you. And the other thing that Yagshimuradov can do, he can reverse takedown attempts really well. He's great at digging both underhooks, and he's got these weird kind of hip tosses from when guys shoot on him. It's just a really interesting thing. Am I predicting he's going to sweep a takedown attempt from Corey Anderson, get on top? No, but those are little details in his game that he might be able to take advantage of Corey Anderson. Because the one thing about Anderson is, yes, his nickname might have changed throughout his career, but his fighting style very much has stayed the same from his earlier tenure on The Ultimate Fighter all the way up through to his time with Bellator.
You don't like to see it out of Yagshimuradov, where he's on such an impressive win streak, 8 fights in a row. His last loss was to Mikhail Rogozin, that was 2-0, and he got finished by him in M1 Challenge 61. But that was 6 years ago, almost, to this point. So for Yagshimuradov, he's continued to win. He's continued to win impressively. And out of his fights, I mean, plenty of 5-round experience, going back to his fight against Batraz Agnayev to win the belt. That one back in 2018. So it's been 3 fights in a row, 5-round pace. And if you look at it for Beaston 25-8, when he took on Melvin Manhoef, yikes, that was a 3-round fight. It is what it is in a main event. Bellator does those all the time. It's really weird. Don't do it anymore. And hey, have a Canadian plan for your fights instead of having them for free on YouTube nice. Like me, but it is what it is. That's also pretty cool. For Corey Anderson, the way out of the UFC was so weird because this is a top 10 ranked fighter that's beaten really good competition. I mean, you look at the 5 on in for this guy. Glover Teixeira, Alir Latifi, Johnny Walker, and if you want to throw it before that, he had Patrick Cummins' 6th last fight. And then you lose to Blachowicz, who we now know is... he's a pretty good old fellow out of Poland, and then he beats Melvin Manhoef. For Corey Anderson, really, really big names. And I mean, the losses. Jimmy Manuwa, people are going to get knocked out by him. Ovin St. Preux, you're going to lose to him. Shogun Hua, you don't like it. That was a really bad performance.
There's another on there, too. Corey Anderson's also a victim of... this fight just pains me to bring up because I do think Corey Anderson is a very good fighter. Jean Vellante knocked him out, and his losses that have aged the worst, I do think that's up there.
Yikes, old body punch Jean, but... when we look at this fight, you're right. For Dovletdzhan Yagshimuradov, A, it's not often that you hear from fighters out of Turkmenistan, but B, a lot of people are predicting him to be a dark horse in this entire tournament, and I love to see it because this guy, like I said, I've been high on him for a really long time. So if we have a look at the odds for this fight, it might surprise somebody, but Corey Anderson opened a plus 120.
I'm surprised.
That line dropped immediately. Anderson now a minus 184 favorite Thursday night before the fight on Friday. For Yagshimuradov, open a minus 150. He's now at a plus 149 with a bit of a dip here recently in those odds. So more people piling on with Corey Anderson. Out of the overall Tapology votes, 810 of them, 78% Beaston 25-8, 69% going with the decision. For the 22% that have Yagshimuradov, 70% by knockout. Matt, I think Dovletdzhan Yagshimuradov can win a decision in this one.
Oh, no, I disagree with you on that, because this is my problem. In a 5-round atmosphere, it's really hard to say, hey, you have to defend... basically, this is what the proposition is. Fight 10 minutes with Corey Anderson, then you have to defend 3 takedowns from one of the best wrestlers in the division. I think that is a very hard ask. Now, I do agree with what the fans are saying, though. If Corey Anderson's going to win, more likely than not by decision. That's how Corey Anderson wins fights. And here's the thing about Corey Anderson. Is it that he has a suspect chin, or does he just get caught clean a lot? Because I do think it's a bit of both cases. Because Here's the thing. People like to say Luke Rockhold doesn't have a good chin, and I don't think he has a great chin by any means, but look back at some of the strikes that have knocked Luke Rockhold out. Well, he got hit with an overhand left from Yoel Romero. That would knock a lot of people out. He got hit with a clean left hook from Michael Bisping. Would knock people out. With Corey Anderson, you look at some of the people. Well, Jimmy Manuel won and lost all of his fights by knockouts. There's no shame in that. And Ovince St. Preux was losing that fight until he lands one of the most beautiful head kicks of all time, I must say. But still, Corey Anderson, even when he is in there and loses against some of the best fighters, he's still having success against those fighters. And I do think that's a really important key, because if he just went in there and got absolutely mopped by Ovince St. Preux, then yeah, I probably wouldn't pick him in this fight. But the fact that I saw him not only go out there and strike with OSP a little bit, but he was just able to out-grapple him to such a degree that in a 25-minute atmosphere, I do just think that that kind of a fight really plays into Corey Anderson's hand. And Corey Anderson might have been a way better fighter if he was fighting 25-minute fights earlier on in his UFC career, because it would allow him to kind of pace himself a little bit more, not just jump into the fire so quick. So for me, I am ever so slightly going to pick Corey Anderson, but this is the case for me. Corey Anderson, his whole time in the UFC, said, I want to fight the top guys. I want to fight the top guys. I want to fight the top guys. If you beat Yagshimuradov, you're only fighting top guys from here on out, Corey Anderson. So if you don't do well in the next round of this
tournament, so yeah.
But if you don't do well in the next leg of this tournament, when you do fight either Rumble, Yoel, Bader.
He has to fight Bader.
I mean the whole way through the tournament. These are the guys who we're going to be comparing Corey Anderson with, and these are the guys that Corey Anderson's wanted to fight for his whole career. So it is nice that hopefully if Anderson is able to win this fight, he will finally be able to get in there with some of those guys that we did talk about in the UFC.
If you like, well, not no time Volkan Oezdemir, but if you like overtime Beast 25-8, the 3-fight win streak before Johnny Walker of Pat Cummins, Teixeira, and Ilir Latifi, those are very, very good fighters, but fighters that can implement that wrestling and that grappling, and they can wear on most of their opponents. And Corey Anderson looked like an absolute world beater through that stretch where he was beating guys, beating Johnny Walker impressively, and then, of course, losing to Jan Blachowicz. The Manhoff fight, I don't care. That was a tune-up fight to get Corey Anderson back and going. Great to see it. 3-round fight for Yagshimuradov. Again, does have a little bit of a layoff coming into this one. His last fight was in December of 2019, so he took all of last year off, found a home here in Bellator. That news didn't really break. It was just kind of like, boom, now he's here, and then what are they going to do with him? Oh, by the way, he's also in this tournament. But for me, I really like the well-roundedness. Positionally, I really like Yagshimuradov, and I think, like you said, again, keeping the hands low, mixing in some of the striking, and using his footwork and the cage to his advantage, I really do like him in this one. So I will edge Dovletdzhan Yagshimuradov to get the win. You're going with the man formerly known as Beastin 25-8.
Here's my disclaimer. Corey Anderson could win 4 rounds, 4 minutes, and 59 seconds of this fight and still find a way to get knocked out. Corey Anderson's done it in the past. He could do it again in the future. That's all I'm saying. But no, I do like Anderson in this one.
Matt, not feeling confident, still feeling confident, and unable to understand how an 8-person tournament works. But, Matt, it was an impressive performance from you, and maybe it'll be an impressive performance with Corey Anderson. We tease, we joke, and we got a lot more show to get to. So if you're just watching this video out on its own, make sure you check out some of the other great content with Fight Night Picks. If you're tuning in for the whole kit and caboodle, make sure you tune in for Vadim Nemkov and Phil Davis. Let's throw it on over to that. And as we always say, Matt, Fight Night Picks, let's get into it. Really interesting fight in our main event of Bellator 257. This one's a rematch, but this time it's for the title. We have Vadim Nemkov representing Russia, taking on Mr. Wonderful Phil Davis, and we talk about it all the time. This guy is one of the best wrestlers in MMA. Well, Phil Davis, low-key, a long time ago, you probably heard that fairly often. You probably heard that in his UFC tenure. And then he went over to Bellator, he captured the title, he lost it, he's been there, he's done that. And in the fight that he had against Vadim Nemkov, it was like absolute role reversal. It was like watching twins and taking it literally and thinking, geez, there's no way Danny DeVito and Arnold Schwarzenegger are actually brothers. You watch that fight, and Phil Davis is a striker, and Vadim Nemkov's a wrestler, and I had to question my existence for a while.
I don't know if Phil Davis in between corners asked his coaches, like what Nate Diaz did with Conor McGregor, oh, he's a wrestler now? Because that's really how their fight went. When I think back of it in my mind, the clearest picture I have is Phil Davis landing far too many overhand rights, and that is kind of concerning. And this is a really interesting rematch because of what you said. Both guys had success in what would normally be considered the other guy's wheelhouse. Vadim Nemkov, great kickboxer, good at staying on the outside, can really flick his jab out there, can wrestle, can grapple, of course, if he has to, but normally his first game plan, well, I'm much faster than most of these guys, and I've got a great variety of kicks. Phil Davis, like taking guys down. But yeah, we really did see both guys kind of jump into the other guy's game, and it was interesting because for me, I think Vadim Nemkov can take a huge confidence boost from that first fight. I do think to a certain degree he was a little bit hesitant on the feet, and you could see that because Phil Davis, when he was moving forward, not that he was constantly making Vadim Nemkov fake, and I always think of Chad Mendes when I say this, but fake down, come over top with the overhand, but just the forward pressure of Phil Davis was making Nemkov question, okay, is he either going to shoot for a takedown or start to strike? And at least the beginning of that fight, Phil Davis was having some really good success. And also, I'd be completely honest, I probably think Nemkov should be the favorite in this whole tournament. I thought Phil Davis beat him in the first fight. I did think Phil Davis won 2-1. Bit of a hot take maybe, but it was a very close fight. So Phil Davis, I think he's going to be confident because, okay, well, I just fought this great striker. He knocked out Ryan Bader. He's supposed to be the next Fedor. I did pretty well in the kickboxing department. And for Nemkov, I don't think you have to be as worried, especially when you're on the back foot against someone like Phil Davis. Because the weird thing about Phil Davis, he's such a good wrestler, and he's not a bad striker by any means, but he doesn't have that high of an output. So if you are on the back foot, more likely than not, he will shoot for the takedown. He's not the type of guy who he's going to really pump his jab, pitter-patter a little bit on the outside. Yes, he does have those skills. Of course, we're talking about a guy who was a world champion at one point, but Phil Davis's bread and butter is, I'm going to try to get close to you, I'm going to get you up against the cage, take you down. Now, the thing about Phil Davis that a lot of people don't realize is he has a great leg kicking game of his own, and yes, I'm sure you'll bring it up, his beautiful head kick win, but Phil Davis's leg kicks are really good, and it's something that if he would go to them earlier on in fights, I do think it would really open up his wrestling as the fight progressed. Could you imagine if you had a Phil Davis who, yes, he always had the pressure, you know he's got the cardio, that's another thing you never have to worry about either one of these guys. What if he could just incorporate a few more leg kicks and really start to make his opponent think that way? Because I really do think, as underwhelming as Phil Davis has looked in his last couple performances, this is the type of fight that A, he can really get up for, and stylistically, Phil Davis is a bit of a bad matchup for Vadim Nemkov.
It's funny because if Phil Davis had those, he would have been a UFC champion.
That's true.
The weird thing about Phil Davis is as his career's gone on, he's gotten better. Like,
Yes.
I really like the Phil Davis that we have here now than we did 10 years ago, let's say. So it's really interesting to see how it's gone for Davis. He was one of those original UFC guys that made the jump over, became a champ. And if you look at his 5-on-in, the one loss to Nemkov about 2.5 years ago, then he beat Liam McGarry, Carl Albrechtsen, and Lyoto Machida his last time out. And for Vadim Nemkov, this is where it gets weird. You look at the two losses, well, one's to a future UFC main eventer in Yuri Prohashka, and then the other one, Carl Albrechtsen. Both of these guys fought Albrechtsen, one won, one lost. The really weird thing, Carl Albrechtsen's fighting on the undercard of this card tomorrow, and the other one is the fact that Vadim Nemkov's brother Victor is going to be on this one, his older brother. So it's going to be weird to see how all of that plays out. But for Vadim Nemkov, is this one of those like city kickboxings? Uh-oh, my teammate lost, yikes. Or is it like Robert Whittaker? I need to see Jacob Malkoun lose before I can have a good performance.
I think maybe that is the case. I hope it's not. I hope him and his brother get along better than that. But
And maybe Malkoun gets a win against Abdulrazak Al-Hassan this weekend.
that could very well happen. But it's the weird thing for Carl Albrechtsen, too, because you see what he was able to do back in Ryzen and what kind of a world beater he was. Then you look at his performances in Bellator, or his performance, I should say. He looked terrible against Phil Davis. He really did. And I was super excited for Albrechtsen. He beat Prohashka. He beat Nemkov. Well, goodness, if you're good enough to beat those guys, then you could probably beat Phil Davis. And then he proceeded to get exhausted really fast and get taken down a bunch. So I don't know if you can really take the Albrechtsen fight too much and incorporate that into this one, because I do think we are dealing with a very new fighter in Vadim Nemkov. And what you said about Phil Davis, I think that holds true for Nemkov too. We're seeing a fighter who, although yes, he is the champ right now, he is still getting better fight in, fight out. And that's the cool thing about Nemkov, because the other neat thing too, Nemkov's a fighter who is a lot faster than most other guys at 205. And with 205, that's kind of the bridge between you have the fast fighters at 205, or at 185, sorry, and you have the slower guys at heavyweight. Vadim Nemkov really does move like a middleweight. Just physically, he matches up so well with these light heavyweights, and that's the cool thing about his game. He can stand at a long range because he is so fast at getting in and out, and he has such good takedown defense that it really is hard for his opponents to get a good read on him.
For Vadim Nemkov, the 5-on-in, actually a lot more spread out than the older fighter. His first fight, a knockout win over a current UFC heavyweight, Felipe Lins. He beat him. The real coming out party was the Liam McGarry fight, where he just kicked his knee, and it looked like a horse's knee. It was disgusting and huge. He beats Phil Davis by split. Again, like you said, very close fight. He beats the former middleweight champ, Rafael Carvalho, and looked great. And then he beats Ryan Bader. And that was a weird fight for a lot of people, because for Vadim Nemkov, you talk, again, to me, the coming out party was McGarry. For Nemkov to win the title, holy smokes, you just won over a big section of fans. And he's a guy that trains out of Stary Ozkol. The pictures are out there, him and Fedor Emelianenko. He even wears the t-shirt for Russian Northern Exploration. Neat. Not as neat if you're Canadian, but neat. But we look at this, Matt, and Nemkov Davis 2. Do you expect it to go like Nemkov Davis 1?
I don't. I do think we are going to get a very different fight in this. Now, again, I'll be very honest. I thought Phil Davis won their first fight, and it wasn't that long ago. But my issue is Phil Davis, just as his style, is somewhat tentative. If you are moving forwards on him, he will kind of wait, at least when it comes to the striking department. Now, Phil Davis has this kind of, I don't want to say cool thing in his game plan, but you see Tyron Woodley just back up to the cage and not really do much about it. When Phil Davis gets backed up to the cage, he does have a really good sense of, okay, I can go left, I can go right, or I can shoot forward and take you down. And when he shoots forward and takes you down, Phil Davis, just as a wrestler moving forward, is just so hard to deal with because he does have some of those finesse-esque grappling, or at least in his wrestling. He has the single legs. He can go to a trip. He can go and just run the pipe. But he can just power double leg, guys, at the end of the day, and that's the great thing about Phil Davis' style. But if you do look at their first fight, look at what Vadim Nemkov can take from the first fight. Every grappling exchange, I at least got out on par with Phil Davis for the most part. And that's what he's supposed to be all that good in. If Nemkov was a little bit hesitant in that first fight because he was worried about the wrestling of Phil Davis, I don't think he's going to have that same issue in this fight. I do think we're going to see a much more comfortable Vadim Nemkov. And I do think the term championship confidence really does matter. And I do think for Vadim Nemkov, maybe even he had to win that title against Ryan Bader to be like, okay, I can fight these guys in Bellator at the top of the league. Because there's a big jump between Liam McGarry, although he was a champ, and Phil Davis. That's a big jump in competition. So now that he has finally beat, three former champions, and then Brian Bader to win the title, I just think Vadim Nemkov, he realizes that, yeah, this is where I'm supposed to be in the Bellator tournament, and I do think he'll be the one moving on to the next fight.
For Vadim Nemkov, this one is second 5-round fight. You saw what happened in the first 5-round fight he had against Bader. Holy smokes. For Vadim Nemkov, open minus 350 favorite. He's now minus 207. Now, the line jumped from 350 to 149, and since then, it has gone down again for your champion. For Phil Davis, line open plus 275. He's now at a plus 166. And if we have a look at the Topology votes, there's a fair amount of them. 861, 87% Nemkov, 53% by decision. Well, he hasn't won in the Bellator cage in 5 rounds, and 42% by knockout. The 13% that have Davis, 60% by decision. And like you said, I mean, whether you saw the first fight for Davis or Nemkov, this one's going to be a lot more interesting again. I like the improvements that Nemkov has made, and you look at the guys that he's fought, holy smokes, and that doesn't take anything away from Phil Davis. You want to talk strength of schedule? Davis has been fighting the harder guys for a very long time, but for Vadim Nemkov to learn from those 2 losses, to just continue to win and finish certain fights emphatically, I really do like that. I like Nemkov in this fight. But listen, I love this. It's a great rematch, and the winner of this fight will go on to fight the winner of Yoel Romero and Rumble Johnson.
What a fight.
Holy smokes.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited for this whole tournament. I love Bellator tournaments. I really do. I might be in the minority. I hope everyone really likes the tournaments too, but I love what they're doing over there. I understand that, yes, some of these guys are former UFC fighters, but they're giving you the matchups that you want from the get-go, and I think that's the really important thing for tournament settings. So I'm really excited for this tournament, no matter who ends up winning, but yeah, I like Nemkov in this.
Big time fight. We're both going with an and still from Michael C. Williams, the voice at the end of it, and Matt, holy smokes, great fights. We've got Yagshimuradov taking on Anderson, and if you missed it, you can go back, or maybe you don't want to. Jake Paul and Ben Askren. Matt, I love it. Let's continue on with the show, and as we always say, let's get into it. All right, we're a full 850 votes into that YouTube community tab poll. Still at 73% that wanted to see the Askren versus Paul content. And in my head, Matt, I went, you know what? If 2/3 want it, then we're doing it. We got more than that. We got your support. And if you're the 27% that said stay in your lane, hey, we wanted to have fun. There's UFC picks, previews, and predictions. We're going to have question mark kicks on Saturday. We love talking Bellator, and I'm so glad that we're back and finally get the opportunity to do so. But Matt, this Bellator card is absolutely stacked. We talked about it in those videos, but Carl Albrechtson's got a really, really big fight coming up. I'm so surprised that it's so far down, but listen, you're taking on another Nemkov. We'll see if really the fortunes can reverse themselves. JJ Wilson missed weight by 3/4 of a pound, taking on Pedro Carvalho. We saw what happened to Ignacio Bahamondes last weekend against John Makdessi. Didn't work for him. We'll see if it works for JJ. I'm really looking forward to Saul Rogers, Mads Bernal. Honest to goodness, that's one of my favorite fights on the card. And that opens the friggin' prelims.
I'm so excited for the Coco main event. It's not even funny. You have Paul Daly's retirement fight against Sabah Homasi. Now,
they hate each other.
Now, here's the thing. You might be a lot more familiar with the career of Paul Daly than you are of Sabah Homasi, but stop. Sabah Homasi is a human highlight reel, and yes, he might not always win his fights, but he's one of those guys who he's either going to win by knockout or lose by knockout, and that's kind of what Paul Daly's in it for too, so that fight is almost guaranteed fireworks on that main card.
Big time fights with Bellator 257. Hopefully you're able to enjoy it tomorrow night being Friday, and if you're checking out the Askren Paul stuff, that is on Saturday. We've also got Fight Night Picks Kicks that goes live 2 hours before the early prelims. Matt, it's a big time boxing weekend. I've got the Butterbean glove with me. Listen, if you're checking out the content, make sure you find it fightnightpicks.com. We've also got great stuff over on the shop.
We have
the
hats.
Under Armour hat. There's all sorts of great stuff. Matt doesn't know how to handle merch.
I'm just going to start handing things off. There's just so much good stuff, Craig.
So much great stuff. So make sure you check out the shop. Matt, loving this weekend. All sorts of great stuff with the fighter interviews as well. So keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks. Loving it. Let's get into it.